angels, swords, and a world spiraling out of control. Today's book explores the themes of loyalty, the greater good, and avenging your BFF's honor on this week's episode of Beyond the Manuscript. But before we get to that good stuff here, I need to introduce my guest for today. Joining us on the podcast is a USA Today's best-selling author with over 20 books. She is currently living in scenic Austin, Texas, here today to talk about her third book in the Morningstar Academy series, Marked. Please help me in welcoming my guest this week, LRW Lee. How are we doing today?
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's it's not every day we get a USA Today's bestseller on the show, but I'm so excited. Not to mention that when someone sent over the cover of this book of Marked here, super intrigued immediately. Like it's really Editor Coop put up a picture of the cover here.
Or author can put it up.
Oh, you have it. You have it right there. You're just holding it up. Yeah.
Of course.
I'll put a bigger picture up in a second. That's awesome. Okay. So to kind of get things started here, please tell us what is the Morningstar Academy and tell us about this third book in this trilogy.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start by saying that I write genre-bending stories in vivid worlds with sweet romance and stunning plot twists that not only help you escape, but actually help you live better. So this is what goes behind all of my series, but the Morningstar Academy series in particular. So when you look at the news these days, I think it's safe to say that you kind of come away with anxiety. It almost feels like the world is upside down. It's like what you once relied upon seems to have something's wrong with it, or it's broken, or whatever. But I find there's a lot of people who live with a lot of anxiety these days just because things aren't working the way they used to. And so I wrote this series to give perspective and also hope with all that's going on. So this is a story it's told from the perspective of celestial warriors and fallen angels. And so they are going about what they're supposed to be doing. A situation unfolds in which Gladriel, our main heroine, her best friend and her partner is injured significantly, and she feels guilty because demons were after her, and her BFF gets in the way, and they basically take revenge on her BFF, so she feels responsible. So she's not supposed to take revenge. She's called before the Almighty. He says, I've got this. Let me handle this. But after a month of his seeming inaction, she's like, I can't stand it anymore. I need to avenge my friend, my partner. And so she goes out and she essentially kills the demons who did it. Well, because the Almighty had specifically told her not to do that, she's expelled from heaven, third heaven. And essentially she then is introduced to what I call second heaven, which is where basically Lucifer and that ilk hang out. And she is enrolled in Morningstar Academy, whose aim is to indoctrinate newly fallen into the other side. And of course, there's immediate conflict because she is not signing up to harm humans, which is exactly what Morningstar Academy is after. It's like they want to make these fallen as callous as possible, and so they subject them to all sorts of events in which they have to hurt humans. And as a result, she's like, and so you have an immediate conflict where she's like, I am not signing up for this. I refuse to do this. And she refuses to subscribe to the school's rules. And you can imagine the chaos that ensues.
Definitely. Very, very, it's really interesting as well is from the Morningstar Academy series. It also kind of tells the end of the world through the book of Revelations, right?
Mhm.
And so, what was it about that particular story that you wanted to do a retelling of, as opposed to creating your own new apocalypse that you wanted to follow? What was it about Revelations specifically that you're like, I want to incorporate this into my book?
Well, isn't that what every author wants to do? I'm kidding.
Blow up the
No,
world a little bit.
I've had other interviewers ask, "What in the world were you thinking when you said, 'Oh, let's do Revelations?'" It's not exactly the most intuitive, right? But my thinking was this: it's like with the world looking the way it is, what better place to look than in an end of the world narrative to get perspective? It's like, what is this? Is this really what's going on? Could it be what's going on? And I love the fact that Revelations is so not understood. There is so much symbolism, there is so much hidden meaning, if you will, that unless you really study it, you it's like, what is all this stuff? It talks about dragons and it talks about, all sorts of stuff that unless you really educate yourself into what it's about, you're like, I have no clue. And as a result, most people they don't spend any time there, understandably. So I'm like, well, this is a huge opportunity because I know there is some curiosity about it if it were phrased in a way that the average layman could understand. So hence that's
Was so one other thing that I do like it as well is whenever an author uses these very famous like stories from various religions about specifically about the end of the world, it really helps the author kind of have a map to follow, right? Where they can kind of do their own interpretations about certain things. Like I'm thinking specifically of Ragnarok, right? Because if people who've actually read the stories of Ragnarok, it is also very strange and very weird. But there's little bits of like pop culture that people can kind of understand through mainstream that an author can then take. Okay, so this is the famous world eating or like sun eating snake, but I'm gonna make him do something very different in my book. And this is, the ship made of dead men's nails, but we're gonna have them all be painted a certain different colors and stuff like that. There's fun things you can do with a kind of mainstream shorthand with something like Revelations as well. Very cool. So I'm still kind of working my way through your books, but in Revelations, do any of the horsemen show up, or is that
yes.
I gotta read and find out kind of a deal?
Well, they do actually. Book two, Damned. So we've got Cursed, Damned, Marked, and then the last one that I'm working on right now is called Destroyed. All very uplifting, But yeah, the four horsemen show up in book two, starting in book two. So, but the one thing I was going to add, based upon what you just said, so in Revelations, what's fascinating is that so if you look at what happened to actually record this, it was John who was seeing a vision. Okay. And so he just explained what he was seeing, almost like if we were watching a video and we were just narrating, okay, I'm seeing this and this and this and this from his perspective. Now, obviously, he didn't have a clue what some of the stuff he probably saw was because that stuff didn't exist back then. But if you think about, um, he was trying to explain in his vernacular what made sense, but he didn't give, if you will, causality to this, a lot of the events he saw. And what I mean by that is this. So he saw a battle taking place, but he's just describing this battle. He doesn't say, oh, well, this is what happened to cause the battle. And so I had to look at the various scenes taking place, and there always has to be a cause in a story, right? So I had to that's a lot of where I came up with. So for example, one of the four horsemen, you're not going to expect how it comes to be because it's never specified, which is so, and I had to create a causation. And so from that, you're going to be, it's going to be one of those stunning plot twists that you will never have expected, but it will explain, oh, okay, so this is how in this story this happens. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, absolutely. My next question is that so the Morningstar Academy comes You wrote it in the point of view from celestials, right? Which is a very different take from most authors who might have written this as a point of view from the aspect of a human. What went behind that decision?
Yeah, so you're right. Most of apocalyptic fantasy is filled with stories from a human perspective. In this particular case, to be consistent with the Revelation narrative, I needed points of view that could explain what was happening. And so, first of all, let me step back. I have when I speak of heaven, there's in the Jewish tradition there are three heavens. There is first heaven, like when you walk out the door and you see the sky, you could say that's first heaven. Okay. Second heaven would be the cosmos, planets, that type of thing. And then third heaven would be outside time space. It would be, if you will, where God hangs out. Okay. So I needed to be able to convey events happening portrayed in the book of Revelations from both third heaven as well as second heaven. And then as the celestials come to earth and do whatever they're doing, be it helping humans out of stupid spots that we get ourselves into, or whatever, right? But so I needed all three in terms of making the story make sense.
And so, because you have so many different points of views, what are some particular benefits of writing a book like that? Or what are some particular challenges of having, different points of views about the same events?
Well, so different points of view, but they are describing different events. So, for example, in most cases, so for instance, we have celestial warriors looking at an event happening in third heaven, which you would never have a fallen warrior seeing that, right? So they're looking at an event from third heaven perspective. We have fallen warriors or fallen angels looking at events in second heaven from their point of view. And the only crossover you would kind of sort of have would be when they end up coming down to earth, both sets of them, and seeing each other on earth and describing. I never really describe the same event from both perspectives. It's either one or the other, and essentially I use whichever set makes most sense to further the plot. So we're not seeing the same series of events happening multiple times. We're just seeing it from one point of view or the other.
You kind of mentioned it a little bit at the top of the show here, but like about a third of the way through the first novel, Galadriel, like she kind of makes the decision to get revenge for her friend and partner, right? And she's mad at the Almighty for having promised, this revenge, but in their own words, not lifting a pinky to do anything, and that she's sick of it, right? And so, can you talk about Glad's decision? And your decision to have her articulate this particular sentiment.
Yeah, so with Gladriel, you have to understand her personality. She, despite being a celestial warrior, which obviously most warriors you see in fiction, they're very disciplined, they obey orders, they whatever. And for the most part she does, but she has a propensity to listen to her heart sometimes and allow it to override her discipline, which so her BFF and partner did a great job at kind of mitigating that up until the point where she doesn't have a partner anymore because her partner is significantly wounded. So, if you will, her conscience or the constraint on her bad behavior is removed, which means that she now follows her heart. And so, especially coupled with the guilt she feels because her partner bore the brunt of the retaliation the demons affected, she's really not willing to wait. She's she immediately goes to, I need to avenge my partner. But as she unpeels the layers, what she realizes is she really was feeling a lot of guilt because of it. And that also fueled her lack of discipline. So,
What do you think would go into a person? I'm granted, I know we're talking about a totally different species of a human being, but let's say you have a person who acts that similar, where they're driven by their emotions and they have to learn how to develop patience and objective thinking and thinking bigger picture stuff like that. How does someone go about doing that in real life? Would you say?
well, I think first you have to want to. This is not going to be something that just magically poof all of a sudden now you have discipline and control, right? It needs to come to a point where I think you face a crisis as a result of your behavior and choosing not to follow orders, if you will. And Glad hits that, right? Because the Almighty doesn't have a choice. He has to expel her from heaven because she disobeyed his order, right? And I think a lot of it for her, she feels like he didn't listen to her. Like she feels like he's not listening. I mean, he made the promise and the commitment that he would take vengeance in his own way and in his own time, but because he didn't act, she was feeling like she hadn't been listened to. So she was feeling a little like, well, he just doesn't care. Whether if you step back and look at what all happens, it's pretty clear he still cares. But she takes the opportunity that, well, she creates an opportunity to exact revenge, even though she knows she's disobeying, and she's rationalized it any way you want. But and so to your question, I think the first thing in changing anything is to notice, and it's always the hardest part. Anytime you want to change a behavior, you first have to notice when you do it, right? It's like, I mean, so you could say, "Ugh, doggone it, I hate it when I whatever." You're like, okay, and you're like, I want to stop doing that, but then you find you keep doing it. So I think the first step is always noticing when you do it, and then start to roll back the layers and say, okay, well, what is it that triggers me to do that all the time? And that's the response. And I think once you figure that out, then you can start taking action to change. But until then, it's nigh impossible.
That's really in profound, I think, where, if when someone acknowledges that a problem is coming from themselves and not blaming it on their external factors of, oh, my boss is a jerk, or my partner is, doing this thing that I don't like, and or they're kind of bringing it on themselves a little bit, or not bringing it on themselves, that's probably the wrong term, but the problem can stem from them, right? Until they acknowledge that the problem is coming from them, it's not going to change. The change is to come from within rather than externally.
Right.
So that's a pretty good insight, I think. When writing the Morning Star Academy books here, how much theological research did you have to do for this, or did you just know all this from doing research on your own throughout the years?
So I actually went to college at Cedarville University and graduated with a minor in Bible. So that helped. But no, it took an awful lot of research on my part. The number of videos I've watched, various things on YouTube, or just interpretations of the Book of Revelations, because I wanted to do my very best to convey what's going on accurately. And I mean, there's so much gloom and doom that at points it's like, wow, this is just really depressing. And trying to find ways to intersperse some levity or some humor or something lighter in the process. But ultimately, it does follow the timeline of Revelations, at least the sequence of events. It's supposed to be a 7-year period. Obviously, 4 books does not go over 7 years, but I mean, and there are other people who have written a more in-depth version of the events in this time period in Revelations. But I think one series is 13 books long, and I'm like, I don't need 13 books. It's like, I think I can, get this done in 4 if we compress the time horizon, right? So the time horizon is not accurate, but the events definitely are.
Yeah. Is there anything specifically about Revelations that you see, like you said, you were doing all that stuff on like YouTube videos and everything, that you saw a lot where you're like, that's completely wrong, like that's inaccurate, that's not, like, what is something that people might have misinterpreted from the Book of Revelations?
Yeah, so there's a big group out there who, when they're talking about battle scenes, they seem to believe that what do I say? So, for instance, they're like, oh, well, that's really a helicopter or that's really a tank that John is seeing. And he just wouldn't know what it was because that didn't exist back then, right? I actually happen to disagree with that. I think what Revelations speaks to is actually more true to life than what people want to say. Oh, it's almost like giving an excuse for, oh, well, the tank, it shoots out fire. I'm like, fire? No, tanks, even today, don't shoot out flames, right? It's like, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. So I think that was the biggest one, that it's like there's an awful lot out there that want to take the symbolism of it and really try to stretch it to the breaking point. And I'm like, now I can see ways that it could still happen today. So let me give you an example. So it talks about a statue. John says it's a statue, okay? But it's given the opportunity to speak and to do various things, which obviously, up until about 20 years ago, I would say, okay, we're talking Michelangelo kind of statues. Anymore, what I look at is I spend an awful lot of time looking at AI and the robots like Amica and so many, it's like you name it, and everybody's got their own model of the thing, right? And I'm like, I could really see an AI robot behaving the way John saw it, speaking, doing what it was doing, as opposed to this statue that's just normally one would expect it to be just standing there, not moving, right? So I'm like, that actually to me makes an awful lot of sense.
Interesting. Now I'm just imagining the Boston Dynamic robot wearing like sandals and just going around waving a sword all the
Yeah.
time now. But yeah, yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from with that. Awesome. Okay, well, we are running a little bit out of time here already. So this book is book number 3 called Marked. What again is book number 4, and when can we expect it out?
Yeah, so just to go back through, it's Morningstar Academy. Book 1 is Cursed. Book 2 is Damned. Book 3 is Marked. Book 4 is Destroyed. And so I am working on Destroyed. This is really the climax of the whole thing, right? I always like to do the last book in the series, do it up really big, so everything comes together. In terms of when, I'm hoping Q4 this year, but it may be Q1 of next. We'll see.
All right, last question of the day. Where can people find your stuff?
Great question. Thank you for that. So LRWLee.com. So if you look at the book, LRWLee.com is my website, and I have everything there. So if you prefer ebooks, paperbacks, I've got a couple hardbacks, or you can, if you are one who prefers Amazon because that's where you get everything else, and that it's just easier that way. They are in KU, so Amazon also, but they're less expensive on my website, lrwlee.com. So I'll give you that hint.
Awesome.
Right.
All right. Well, I want to thank my amazing guest for the week, LRW Lee, for joining me on this week's episode of Beyond the Manuscript, which, of course, is powered by manuscripts where you never write alone. Lee, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.